In this Avowed video, I'm going to be going through the attributes and abilities of characters in this game, trying to give you guys some useful information from the hours upon hours of the game I have already played, to just kind of help you make better decisions about what sort of character that you want to make to help you either theory craft or just kind of guide you during the early stages of the game. Now, Avowed itself is not a particularly difficult game, and depending on what difficulty setting you're playing on, some of this information will be more or less valuable. Obviously, the harder difficulties require more precise character building in order to get through. So let's get into attributes first before we get into abilities. So firstly, on the attribute screen, you can see that I have 23 points available at level 20 for this game. The max level, I believe, is level 30, so I should be getting quite a few more attribute points before the end of the game, but that's still about one every level so far, give or take a little bit. You'll also notice if you look next to my attributes, you'll see green numbers and like a little green asterisk. And that's because that means the actual stat I'm getting, or the value I'm getting, is 1 or 2 based on equipment or buffs that I have. That's really relevant because there are soft caps in this game, and I'll get into what those are now. So soft caps are the points in attributes where you start seeing diminishing returns. And if you take the example of might, for instance, when you first start putting points into might, you're going to get 3% damage, total damage increase, plus 10% carrying capacity increase per point. But once you hit the effective value of 5, this is going to go down to 2% damage per point, and it's going to go down to 7% increase in carrying capacity. Why this is important is because if you're already gaining a buff from something, then you will hit that soft cap sooner. Once you put 5 points in something, you already have 1 point of might, and you're technically at level 6, so you'll notice that the stats are reflected that way. And there is a second soft cap as well at 10. So you'll notice once I hit like 10 in might, for instance, or effective level of 10, you'll start seeing the damage go down to 1% per level, and the effective carrying capacity increases about 3.33% per level. So what this means is that when you're making a character, if you're planning on going, like let's say perception, because you like critical hit chance and you're getting 3% per level, I think that's really great. Well, the reality is that you're not going to get 3% per level for very long. So when you're making your character, it actually kind of behooves you to spread your points around a little bit more to avoid the soft caps than it does to go hard down one path. And there are exceptions, of course, like you don't have to avoid the soft caps. You can go into them if you want, if you have a particular build in mind, and we'll go into why you might do that while we go through the attributes. So first up is might. This increases your damage and increases your carrying capacity. And these two things are really good bonuses to have. Damage is damage. No matter what sort of build you're playing, more damage is good. So might fits into just about any build in this game. And carrying capacity is just nice to have because you pick up stuff in this game constantly, and you will be overweight constantly. You can send stuff to your stash from your inventory anywhere on the landscape, so it's not such a big deal. But having more carrying capacity is also nice. And keep in mind as well that a lot of these attributes will play a role in dialogue checks. So if you have high might, you can sometimes convince people of things by using the might option, so the higher might you have, the easier that'll be to do. So might is one of the best all-around attributes. If you don't know what to put points into might. I wouldn't take it higher than an effective level of 10 though, because you really start to see the diminishing returns at 1% and 3% carrying capacity at this point. 10 is probably where I would leave it before going to something else, just because you're just really not getting a lot of bang for your buck past that point. Constitution increases your max health and poison and bleed resistance. You don't really get bled too much in the game. You do get poisoned quite a bit, so poison resistance is nice. And, you know, having more health means that you don't die as much. Usually enemies are focused more on you than your companion, so having higher health is not a bad idea. There is a passive ability that you can take that increases your max health as well. So if you'd rather spend like a passive ability point to get max health rather than a point here, I think that's a better idea because you can only spend one passive ability point and get 20% max health, which is effectively 4 levels into Constitution. You don't get the bleed and poison resist from it. But Constitution is going to be much, much better on a character that's probably more front lines, like a melee-focused character, especially if you're playing a melee-focused character that's not using a shield. Like if you're running in two-handed or you're running in dual-wielding, you know, being very aggressive in the way you're attacking and you're never blocking, then Constitution would do you pretty good. But generally speaking, I find it to be one of the least useful attributes, because if you have a mix of range and melee, which I think a lot of builds will, or if you're playing a ranged character, you generally won't need much Constitution. And as I mentioned, you can get some health from passive abilities anyway. So next is Dexterity. Dexterity is really important for increasing attack speed and action speed. Attack speed affects weapon attack speed, so like if you're meleeing how fast you swing. It also attacks ability speed, and this is important because this affects cast speed. So if you're casting spells that have long cast times, it will shorten the cast time so they cast faster, which is really important for wizards. And it also affects reload speed. So if you're someone who's using like pistols, or you're using like an arquebus, and you like using these weapons, the more dexterity you have, the faster these weapons will reload. And the action speed that's affected is also things like swapping weapons. So if you like, you know, have two sets of weapons and you're swapping back and forth, it affects how fast you parkour and also how fast you use like consumables in combat. So dexterity is a very important attribute for just about any build, because any build can really benefit from this. Perception governs critical hit chance and maximum range. Range impacts like the damage that you're going to deal with a weapon if you're hitting over a certain distance. Like the further away an enemy is, the less damage you're going to deal with ranged weapons. And critical hit chance is just great in general because there are a lot of things that can increase your critical hit damage, and you can play a critical focus build. There are lots of gear pieces that trigger effects on critical hit. There are passive abilities that increase critical hit chance and critical damage. So perception is probably, in my opinion, the best overall attribute to choose if you don't know what to pick. I know might is great all around as well, but because there are so many things that trigger off critical hit and so many things that can boost critical hit damage, I would recommend taking perception over might generally. And obviously, if you're playing a ranged weapon, this is only more true because you're going to get that maximum range out of it, or if you're using one of your weapons is a ranged weapon. And also keep in mind that ranged weapons applies to wands. So if you're using a wand as one of your attacks, you're going to want to increase your maximum range. Wands have much shorter range than firearms do or bows do in general. So if you're using a wand, you're absolutely going to want some perception. Now, intellect is an interesting one because it gives you maximum essence and elemental resistance. Both of these are good. Maximum essence is more useful on wizard builds that cast a lot of spells regularly, but also useful for builds that use a lot of abilities or a combination of abilities and spells, hybrid builds. And the amount of essence you need really is kind of up to how many of these you use in combat. A lot of abilities have lengthy cooldowns, so you can't spam them, and sometimes you're just like firing a ranged weapon, or maybe you're just going in, mashing R1 or swinging, etc. So you don't really have to have a lot of intellect, and the amount of intellect that you need is kind of dependent on the amount of abilities and spells that you cast. If you're someone who just, you know, goes in, parries everything, attacks with R2, blocks everything, and then occasionally uses an ability, you probably don't need much intellect. But if you're someone who goes in and, like, you know, uses two abilities and then casts a spell and then goes to attack, you're going to be out of essence at that point. So you probably want at least 5 points of intellect on most builds, because that's a good breakpoint, maybe 10 or higher if you're playing some sort of mage build. And lastly, we come to resolve, which increases your maximum stamina and your second wind efficiency. Stamina is one of the key attributes or key factors of combat in Avowed. If you are meleeing a lot, specifically, you're going to tear through your stamina. If you're blocking a lot or dodging a lot, you're going to tear through your stamina. So if you're playing a melee-focused character, you're absolutely going to want to have some resolve, because otherwise you're going to be limited in the amount of damage you can do and the amount of blocking you can do by the amount of stamina that you have. And there are lots of pieces of equipment that can give you stamina, so you don't have to put a lot of points here. But if you do plan on playing a melee-focused build, like a pure melee build, I would plan to put at least like 4 or 5 points here in order to increase your stamina so you can attack more before having to wait for your stamina to regenerate. And second wind efficiency just makes it so that it refreshes, or the cooldown comes off second wind more regularly so that you can use it more often. Second wind triggers when you get down in combat and allows you to get up for free once, and then it goes on cooldown. So you can use this more often. You shouldn't plan for this, because that means you're planning for failure, but it's still nice to have. So let's take a look at the abilities. We'll go through Fighter first. The first ability here is Charge. This allows you to charge at an enemy that you're looking at and sort of interrupts them and knocks them backward for a second and deals some damage. Doesn't deal a lot of damage, but it's really good for interrupting enemies, for getting back into melee range if you're playing a melee character. And I find it particularly good against enemies that are using a shield to kind of knock their guard away for a second so you can get some hits in. And you don't have to have a shield to use this. You can use this on two-handed or dual wield, or, you know, even with a ranged weapon. So this is just really good for getting back into melee range. If you upgrade it, it will go 100% further. It goes pretty far anyway, so I'm not sure you need this, but if you absolutely want to make sure you can always hit something with Charge, 2 ranks is good. I don't think you need the 3rd rank. The stun it deals is not very much. Up next is Armored Grace. This decreases the stamina penalty for medium and heavy armor by 15 by default. It goes up to 25 at rank 2 and 30 at rank 3, so you get diminishing returns. I would recommend maybe 1 point in this early on, because heavy and medium armor are going to reduce the amount of stamina you have. And as I mentioned, stamina is really important to melee characters. Specifically, if you're not playing melee but you're using medium and heavy armor, then you probably don't need this. But if you are in melee range and you're going to be blocking with a shield or dodging a lot, attacking with melee attacks as fast as you can, this is a good way to help give you some... It's basically giving you stamina back. 1 point gives you 15 stamina, effectively, if you're wearing either of these armor types. So consider at least 1 point here. 2 points might not be bad if you're playing pure melee, but I don't think 3 is worth it because of the diminishing returns. Up next is Shield Bash. This allows you to basically attack with your shield while an enemy is near you once every 3 seconds. Doesn't do a lot of damage, but it's great for like interrupting enemies. It's great for, again, shielded enemies that are holding shields to kind of knock them for a second so that you can hit them. The thing that I find kind of negative about this skill is that I tend to use it a lot while I'm not trying to use it because I sometimes don't let go of block before I press attack when I'm playing a melee build. And because it costs 15 essence, you can kind of drain your essence almost inadvertently by using this ability so frequently. So if you find you're having essence management problems, you might want to remove this skill and try not to use it. But I do find it's really nice for just dealing with like heavy melee units against you most of the time. Upgrading it increases the stun dealt by Shield Bash and the distance enemies are pushed back. I'm not sure either of these are worth it, in my opinion, for the amount of stun that it does. Up next, we have Constant Recovery. This makes it so that after taking damage, you slowly regenerate 50% of the last amount of health lost for 12 seconds. This is just good overall in general. When you're in combat, there's just so many enemies most of the time that you can't see and block everything or dodge everything. So getting health back is great. Whether you're playing a fighter, ranger, wizard, whatever archetype, this is just a good one all around to have. 50% is what you get for 1 point, 75 for 2, and 100% for 3. Ideally, you'd probably have 3 points here by the end of the game, but I don't think you need to do that immediately. I would just get 1 here early on, particularly if you're having trouble staying alive. Next is Toughness, and this simply just gives you more health. 20% at rank 1, 35% at rank 2, 45% at rank 3, so it's got some diminishing returns. This is really good in my opinion, and it's probably one of the reasons why you might not need to invest in Constitution that much. If you take a couple ranks of this, you're getting like 6 or 7 levels of Constitution. You don't get the bleed and poison resistance that Constitution gives you. But even just 1 point of this goes such a long way. I recommend pretty much every character like getting at least 1 or 2 points here. Barbaric Shout makes it so that you spend some essence and you let out a roar that interrupts enemies and makes it so that your weapon attacks become uninterruptible and deal more stun damage. A great strategy of melee characters is to build up stun on enemies and then, hit them for like a bunch of attacks once their stun bar is full. So this can be really nice to use, particularly if that's kind of the strategy that you're going for, stun buildup. And when you upgrade it, it also gives you temporary HP and taunts all nearby enemies. I don't know if taunting nearby enemies is great, actually, because you kind of want enemies like each attacking one person rather than attacking you, at least on lower difficulties. If you're playing on higher difficulty or the highest difficulty, maybe that's, better. And then rank 3 increases the duration by 10 seconds, which is great. So I think this is probably one that you're only going to play if you're planning on playing like a tank build. Someone that's going to use medium or heavy armor and a shield, and you're going to, be ready for enemies to come at you. Or maybe in the case if you're just going the stun build-up route, it would be a good idea. So moving on to bleeding cuts, this is going to make it so when you do power attacks with axes and great swords, you do bleed build-up, and it just kind of increases the bleed build-up you get as you go higher and higher in rank. And this is a great skill to take if you are using like a two-handed playstyle that's using axes or great swords. Damage over time is really, really good in this game, in my opinion. It's good in a lot of games, but it's good particularly here, especially if you can stack up many different damage over times. So if you're planning on playing like a two-handed playstyle, this would probably be a good one to take if you like doing power attacks. If you don't like power attacks, then I wouldn't recommend taking it. Iron Fists basically increases the damage that you do playing unarmed. I have never played unarmed in this game, but I suppose there are people out there that might want to play unarmed. And I think in order to do an unarmed playthrough, you basically have to take all of these passives. So if that's your plan, you're definitely going to take this one. If you're using any other weapons, this is not a useful ability for you. Up next is Devastating Criticals. Devastating Criticals makes it so that your critical hits with melee weapons deal more damage. 30% at rank 1, 50 at rank 2, 60 at rank 3. This is an absolutely staggeringly good passive ability, and as I mentioned earlier, there are lots of ways to increase your critical chance, including Perception. This is a way to boost your critical damage. So I highly recommend, if you're playing a pure melee build, taking at least 2 ranks of this one, maybe 3 by the end of the game, but at least 2, because you get 50% more for 2 ranks, which is really, really good, especially if you have high critical. If you're not building for critical, it might not be as valuable to you. Next is Brawn, which increases your damage with 2-handed melee weapons. This is pretty typical. If you're planning on playing a 2-handed build, you should definitely take at least 2 points of this, maybe 3 by the end of the game. So up next is Power Jump. What Power Jump is going to do is it's going to give you a passive effect where if you hit crouch while you're falling in the air or from jumping in the air, you're going to slam down and do an AoE that does lots of stun and deals damage. And as you upgrade it, you're going to be immune to non-lethal fall damage when you do it. So, like, if you fall from a height but it's not going to kill you, you'd be fine. But if it's going to kill you, you're going to die. And then the third rank makes it so it costs 0 essence instead of 30 essence. This is very situational for damage. There are times when you can get the drop on enemies by jumping down on them, and it's really fun to do. But I think, honestly, the utility from rank 2 is probably the best thing from this, where there's a lot of times where you're very high up in the game and, you know, you're going to take fall damage jumping down in modest ways, and you could use this instead. But considering it has a 20-second cooldown, it's not one that I'm going to recommend for the majority of people. Next is Unbreakable, which decreases the amount of stamina you lose when blocking attacks. If you're going to play with a shield and be a tank, you will have to block sometimes. You can dodge instead of blocking. Dodge is probably more effective as a whole if you're, you know, have good reflexes. Otherwise, you know, standing there and blocking while your teammates do their, you know, you use your abilities and stuff like that is not a bad strategy. I would highly recommend placing at least 1 point here if you're going to be blocking with a shield at all. 2 points is also not bad because you still get up to 50%. I don't think 3 is worth it. It wouldn't go higher than that. Next, we come to Stunning Blows. This makes it so power attacks with maces and two-handed hammers deal 25% more stun, 40% more stun, and 50% more stun. If you're playing a stun build where you're trying to go for stuns, this is probably a no-brainer to take. I'd probably take at least 2 ranks, probably 3 ranks by the end of the game. So if that's kind of your strategy and you plan on using those weapon types, it's a good idea. Again, maces is one-handed, so if you want to use like a mace and a shield, you still want to stun build, you could take this as well. Next is Built to Destroy. This makes it so destroying things restores a small amount of health and essence, which converts to regen if you go over your cap. I don't think this is necessary at all. You have so many consumables that heal you over time. This is just a time waster. It's a waste of a ability point. Don't put a point here. Next, we have Into the Fray. This pulls an enemy towards you and taunts them. It's great for like yanking them to you or getting them off a friendly. Rank 2 increases the range you can use it by, and rank 3 increases the amount of enemies that it can be used on. This is not a bad ability, but also if you have any gear that has movement speed on it, or if you have charge, you can get into melee range very easily. So I'm not sure it's one that is super necessary, but you can take if you want to mix up your gameplay. Reflect is a passive that allows you, when you block projectiles with a shield or a wand, to reflect arrows or projectiles back at the attacker. This is actually really nice. There are a lot of ranged enemies that will constantly attack you in the game, and it might seem daunting to try and pull this off at the beginning, but once you start to get the hang of combat, if you're using a shield or a wand, it's not a bad idea to pick this one up because it's not that hard to time, and it can help you increase your damage and also deal with ranged enemies, which are really annoying in this game. Next is Retribution. This makes it so after taking damage from an enemy, your next attack within 5 seconds deals 70% of the original damage you received. This is actually just a good all-around ability to have no matter what build you're playing. Because if you think about it, like if you're playing like a ranged build that's using like an arquebus or pistols or something, and you get hit by a ranged target, then your next shot's going to deal even more damage. Especially like if you're talking like an arquebus, something that has very, you know, a reload time that's significant but very high damage. That next shot's going to deal so much damage that, you know, you can kill things more quickly. So I think this is a very good one overall. Recommend it more maybe on ranged characters than melee, because on melee you're going to be getting hit regularly and usually being hit for less damage because of your armor and stuff like that. Next, you have Clear Out. This allows you to spin in a whirlwind that's uninterruptible and hits all nearby enemies with your melee weapons. If you upgrade it, it does more rotations. One of the things that Ranger and Warrior lack is AoE generally. They don't have a ton of AoE, so this is a great way to give your melee character some AoE. Again, I don't find that a ton of enemies are grouped up most of the time in the game, so it's very situational when you will use it. But if you don't have any AoE at all in your group, like the companions you pick don't have any AoE, it's a great way to pick some up. Might want to do that if you don't have any. And lastly, in this tree is Inspiring Triumph. This is a passive that makes it so killing enemies restores 10% of your companion's maximum health, 20% if you upgrade it again. On lower difficulties, this is not relevant. Like, your companions aren't really going to die. They do have passive abilities that can heal. They have passive abilities that can bubble themselves. So I don't think you need it. But if you're planning on playing on like harder difficulties, then this might come in very, very handy because you can just heal them while you're just doing what you're doing anyway. Next is the Tanglefoot ability. This is the first ability in the Ranger tree. This allows you to basically root an enemy in place for 8 seconds with a cooldown of 10 seconds. If you upgrade it, it deals poison accumulation, and if you upgrade it again, it increases the duration by 4 seconds up to 12 seconds. So this is definitely one that you'll probably want to get upgraded if you're playing a pure ranged build at some point, but it's hard to justify all those points into it near the beginning of the game. Next is Survivalist. This makes it so food restores 20% more health and essence, and bonus effect durations are increased by 20%. If you upgrade it, you unlock recipes for strong healing foods and recipes that have powerful effects. I don't really worry too much about consumables effectiveness in this game. I just use what I have, and if I need more healing, I just consume more, or use a potion, or use an ability. So I don't think this one is super necessary. Next, we have the parry ability. This allows you to block attacks at the time of the attack, a melee attack in this case. That will knock enemies backward and allow you the opportunity to do a counterattack. Also does some stun buildup on them, and as you upgrade it, it deals even more stun. So it can be a good way to build up stun on enemies that you're tanking if you're not specifically going for like a crazy stun build, or maybe you're using like a hammer with the stun buildup passive, and you're using this, and you're just tanking and going for stun buildup. That could be a way to go. I like at least 1 point in this just to unlock the parry ability because I use a shield, but not everyone is going to play that way. Next is Steady Aim. This makes it so that when you're doing a power attack with a bow or a gun, time slows by 25, 50, or 75% depending on what rank. I find this to be unnecessary. It's not too hard to hit enemies when you're far away anyway. Like, even with a controller, it's not hard to do. If you have terrible aim and you want to play a ranged character, this might be something to take, but you shouldn't need it because this doesn't increase your damage, it just makes it easier to hit your target. And next we come to Evasive. This reduces the stamina cost of dodging by 25, 35, and 50%. I dodge a lot even though I play like a tank character in my playthrough, so this is definitely one I can see people wanting to pick up, particularly if they don't have any points in Resolve or they don't have gear that gives them stamina. It's a great way to improve your stamina efficacy so that you have more stamina to melee while you're dodging around. So if you're playing like a melee build that's primary means of avoiding damage is dodging, or you find yourself dodging a lot, getting at least 1 or 2 points here would be good. Next is Shadowing Beyond. This makes it so that you're invisible while you're draining your essence until you do something. And as you upgrade it, you'll gain increased stealth attack damage and move speed. And if you upgrade it again, you'll reduce the amount of essence or the speed that the essence drains while you're invisible. This is great if you're trying to play like, a ranged sniper or some type build or something like that. But keep in mind that usually when you pick off an enemy, like it'll alert the other enemies anyway. So this will probably be more useful for like sneaking up to like melee kill enemies from stealth rather than range and then get into melee combat. But it's a really fun skill to play with. I'm just not sure it's absolutely necessary unless you're playing like a melee rogue type build. Next we come to Piercing Thrusts. This makes it so power attacks with daggers, swords, and spears deal 25% more damage, 35%, 50%. I love power attacks with these weapon types, but I find I just mash attack more often than not because I have high crit chance, and I'm trying to trigger as many critical hits as possible. So it really depends on the way that you've built your character, I think. There are equipments and things that increase your power attack damage. So if you're going for like high damage, single, longer attacks rather than repeated attacks with high crit chance, this could be good for you if you're using these damage types. Finesse increases the damage with one-handed melee weapons. If you're playing like dual wield, or if you're one-handing and shield, or you're just one-handing something, this is a good one to take. I'm usually playing sword and board, so I usually have like 1 or 2 points here. Probably want 3 points by the end of the game because of the diminishing returns on it, but you're definitely going to want at least 1 or 2 points if you're using a one-handed melee. Next is Marksmanship. This increases your damage with bows and guns. This is a no-brainer if you're planning on using at least one weapon that's ranged. Again, I use an arquebus for one of my weapons, so increasing that damage, even the diminishing returns, is great because a lot of times you can one-shot enemies with an arquebus, just removing an enemy completely and doing 90% damage to an enemy and then having to reload for 10% damage is awful. So particularly if you're trying to go for a one-shot, one-kill build, you're definitely going to want to take Marksmanship, or if you're using any sort of ranged weapon that's a bow or a gun. Next is Scavenger. This makes it so when you pick up herbs, occasionally you'll get extra upgrade materials. You get a lot of upgrade materials in this game, so I'm not super sure that it's worth it. The rank 2 is actually pretty good. Crafting upgrade materials cost you 25% less, so you need less upgrade materials. As you get higher into the game and you're crafting higher and higher quality stuff, that's going to be really useful. So I recommend getting to rank 2 of this eventually for anyone that's playing the game. Next is Power Slide. This makes it so your slides pass through enemies and knock them down, but cost essence. I fairly rarely find myself sliding through enemies. I guess if you wanted to play that way, you could, but I really honestly don't do that very much. It increases the slide distance when you upgrade it, and enemies are knocked down by Power Slide take stun damage when you use it if you upgrade to rank 3. I guess if you're playing a really mobile character and you just like sliding in the game, which admittedly is fun, you could intentionally slide into enemies, but otherwise you're probably not going to take this. Quick switch increases your equip speed by 50%. So this is like when you're swapping weapons, it's going to increase the speed at which you swap weapons. The two scenarios I find this particularly useful in are as if you're like playing with a ranged weapon in one slot and then like a melee weapon in the other. So like maybe you have like a wand and grimoire and a sword, or maybe you have like an arquebus and sword and shield in the other hand or something like that. And you begin with ranged and then enemies close the distance on you and you want to swap to your melee to get, to melee them quickly. That's a great scenario to have this. So having one rank would be good for that. Another scenario would be if you have like pistols in one slot and an arquebus in another, or two arquebuses, and you want to switch with and then fire again without having to reload. And that is also a viable scenario. But if you're going to do that scenario, I recommend taking 2 ranks, because this makes it so guns in your inactive loadout reload automatically after 3 seconds. So if you had like 2 pistols in one hand and you fired them both and then switched weapons and fired 2 more pistols and then switched back, theoretically it would reload in that time, roughly. It would reload them automatically, so you never have to stop firing your pistols if you want, or arquebus, etc. Up next is arrow deflection. This makes it so that when you parry with a melee weapon, that you can actually block arrows or projectiles with a melee weapon and not a shield. So if you're playing like two-handed or something like that, like a two-handed melee build or a dual-wield melee build, this could be great for you. Next is bear ally. This makes it so that you summon a bear in combat that can attack for 30 seconds. If you upgrade it, it will roar and taunt enemies, increasing its damage, and then upgrading it again will increase its duration to 45 seconds. In my opinion, this is when you either go all in on and rank it all the way up and use the bear as effectively as possible, or you just don't take at all. I generally find I don't need more companions in combat. I'm doing most of the damage myself, so it's completely up to you, but if you want some sort of summons, this could be a good way to get one. Next is critical strike. This increases your critical hit chance by 10%, then 15%, then 20%. This is one of the best all-around passives in the game. As I was mentioning earlier, just about every sort of attack in this game can benefit from critical hit. There's lots of things that boost your critical damage, as I mentioned, and we showed some of them. Lots of equipment as well. So if you want to make a critical focused build, you're absolutely going to pump this out. And even if you're not, it's still probably worth at least taking 1 point here, maybe 2 or 3, if you're not sure what to put your points in. Next is sniper. This increases your ranged weapon damage against unaware enemies, so enemies that haven't detected your presence yet. This is 25%, then 35%, then 40%. I have 1 point here because you get your best bang for your buck at 1 point. Also, usually by the time you kill one enemy, the other enemies are aware that you're there, so I don't really feel like it's super necessary to go higher than that. But if you want to make sure, like if you're using like an arquebus or something like that, you want to make sure you absolutely kill that first enemy with your first shot, you might want to consider taking 2 or 3 ranks in this eventually, so that you're always wiping out one enemy with your first shot. Next is Flurry of Blows. This makes it so that you gain maximum attack speed, rapid stamina regeneration, and increased move speed for 10 seconds. And this is another one that I highly recommend if you're going to get, you just go all in on, because it makes it so that you have lifesteal at rank 2 and increases the duration to 15 seconds at rank 3. And it's very expensive at 70 essence and has a rather lengthy cooldown at 25 seconds. By getting the maximum out of this, it's going to be more essence efficient. And this is probably one of the most deadly abilities in the game, because you can basically just go insane for, up to 15 seconds. And if you're playing like melee, you're going to just go like swing, moving all over the place, stamina regenerating quickly. Next, you have Staggering Shot. This makes it so power attacks with bows and guns deal more stun damage. And I would say that this is not super useful. I don't really try and stun things when I'm using my ranged weapon. I'm usually just trying to kill things. If I'm playing melee, I tend to try and stun sometimes, but unless you're going for like a specific build where your whole objective is to try and stun, you're usually just trying to kill things with like 1 shot or 2 shots from range. So don't find this particularly useful most of the time. Okay, moving on to Wizard. First ability is Minor Missile. This makes it so that you summon 3 magical projectiles that seek out an enemy and deal a large amount of damage to them. As you upgrade it, you get more missiles, 5 missiles at rank 2, 6 at rank 3. So you probably don't want to go higher than 2 ranks in this, at least early on in the game. It does decent damage, but I find it not to be the most useful spell. The best thing about it is that you can cast it regularly every 10 seconds, and you don't need to have a grimoire equipped. So it could be a way to give you a ranged attack if you're not using a grimoire, but most of the time, you'll probably use grimoire spells if you're playing a wizard. Next is Armored Essence. This decreases the essence penalty for light and medium armor by 15 at rank 1, 25, and 30 at rank 2 and 3. So what's good about this is it's going to give you more essence if you're wearing these armor types, and you'll probably be wearing one of these if you're playing a pure wizard. If you're playing some sort of hybrid, you might be using heavy armor. Again, essence isn't a huge problem unless you're playing a pure mage, so I think this is definitely worth it if you're playing a pure mage build. But if you're not really playing someone who's casting spells all the time, but only sometimes, probably not worth it. Chilling Blade sends out blades of ice that deal frost accumulation, can freeze the target over a good distance. Upgrading it makes it so they deal bleed accumulation as well, so they can bleed targets, and at rank 3, it will pierce through multiple enemies. This is great for freezing targets. You can freeze water with it too, to jump on water to get up to places, so it does have some utility. You can freeze areas that, you know, have the freeze prompt to get through, like iron bars, which is nice. But my thought on spells is this. If you have a spell that you like, you should probably plan on going all in, all 3 ranks in on it. And what selecting a spell in Avowed does is it allows you to cast it without using a Grimoire. You can map it, and even if you don't have a Grimoire out, you can still cast it. So why that's good for a wizard is maybe you have a really good Grimoire that has really good passive benefits and really good spell list, but it doesn't have like your 1 or 2 favorite spells. By taking those spells, you can still cast all those great spells and use that great Grimoire and still cast these spells as well. What it does for other builds, like maybe you're playing a ranged build that's using a bow or pistols or an arquebus, but you want to cast fireballs. What is great about this is that you can cast that fireball without having a Grimoire equipped. So you don't have to switch to the Grimoire to cast it. You can just stay on your ranged weapon and cast fireball when it's, you know, available for you. So that's great. Or maybe you're playing like a fighter type character and you want to have like Ring of Frost or Ring of Flame around you, but you don't have to swap to a Grimoire to cast it and then swap back to your weapons. So now you can just cast it while your weapons are out and then run into combat with it out. So picking spells usually is more beneficial to hybrid characters, but it's also great for wizards that, you know, want to use the best Grimoire they can find, even if it doesn't have the best spells that they want. So Fan of Flames is like a cone of fire in front of you that builds fire accumulation on the enemy and deals fire damage, and if you upgrade it, you use both hands and do more damage and more fire accumulation, double, and rank 3 increases the duration by 4 seconds that it's cast. This is a really good early game spell for getting fire onto enemies, setting them on fire. It has a very short range compared to a lot of other spells though, so it puts you in melee range, which means that I recommend, you know, this probably more on a hybrid build that's going to be wearing like medium heavy armor, that's going to be meleeing and wants to do some spell casting periodically. Otherwise, I'm not sure I would take this one. And again, if you plan on picking it, just go all in on it when you can. Jolting Touch is a good early game spell that will basically deal electric damage to an enemy, and then it'll bounce to another nearby enemy, and when you upgrade it, it'll bounce to even more. Kind of like a weaker chain lightning, if you will. Builds up shock accumulation on enemies. Shock does like damage over time, cause like a pulse that deals damage to enemies around them, which is nice. It's also good for certain puzzles in the game. Again, if you're lacking AoE, if you're playing like a melee build or a ranged build and you want some AoE, this would be a good way to get some at a little bit longer range than like Fan of Flames. Corrosive Siphon is a sort of beam spell that deals poison accumulation to enemies and also heals you simultaneously. It's a great way for a wizard to heal. It's typically like not that long a range, so you'd have to get kind of close. Makes a lot of sense, in my opinion, if you're playing like a melee type character and you want a way to heal up real quick and you can just throw it up every time it's off cooldown. And if you rank it up, enemies are stunned in place while you're using it, so that's really nice. And if you rank it up again, you can make it so that if you overheal, you gain extra temporary health, which, you know, gives you a reason to use it even if you're not at, if you don't need the healing. You can just use it every time it's off cooldown if you're playing like a melee sort of character, that then just getting extra health on top. So Parasitic Staff's an interesting one because it summons basically a melee staff for you that restores essence when you strike enemies. And at rank 2, you can do a power attack for 20 essence that does high stun damage and an AoE, does AoE damage and restores even more essence. And rank 3 extends the duration to 45 seconds. I think you're predominantly going to play this on like a fighter type build that may want something that can replenish its essence easily, particularly if you're going through essence a lot. And particularly if you have bonuses that apply to like two-handed weapons. So this could be great for some sort of hybrid build. If you're playing a regular wizard and you're trying to stay at range and you're kind of squishy, you're probably not going to use this spell. So up next is Arcane Veil. This is arguably my favorite spell in general, no matter what build you're playing. This makes it so for 20 seconds that you have an arcane shield that makes your spell casting uninterruptible, which is very important if you're planning on playing a pure mage, so you don't get interruptible casting. But also increases your damage reduction by 50%. That is huge. If you're playing melee, if you're playing ranged, if you're playing wizard, 50% damage reduction is incredible. Highly recommend this spell on every single build out there, at least 1 point. Now, if you upgrade it to rank 2, it will actually reflect arrows and projectiles back at attackers automatically, which is also great because you tend to get plinked by them. So that's a fantastic upgrade. And then rank 3 will knock back melee attackers that are striking you. All these things happen passively once you've cast the spell on yourself. So even getting to rank 3 is really good with this. But I highly recommend at least 1 rank because it'll just help keep you alive no matter what you're doing. So the next ability is Blast. This makes it so power attacks with wands explode, dealing less stun and explosive damage to nearby enemies, but nonetheless hitting them. And as you upgrade it, it makes it so that they all take the same stun damage as the original target, and then if you upgrade it again, they all take the same damage as the original target. So if you like doing power attacks with wand, and you need some AoE, some cheap AoE, this is a great way to get some. Next is Bounce. This makes it so power attacks with wands bounce to a nearby enemy, dealing reduced damage, but retaining all elemental accumulation. Ranking it up makes it so that it bounces to additional targets, and ranking it up again makes it so it bounces to even more targets. If you're planning on taking the last passive we just mentioned, you should probably take this one as well, just to make your power attacks more effective and lean into power attacks with your wands. Next is Wand Mastery. This just increases the damage with your wand, and this applies to either power attacks or regular attacks with your wand. If you're using a wand, you're definitely going to want to have this, or dual wielding wands or whatever. You're definitely going to want to have this. Wands are, lower damage than a lot of other melee weapons, but they attack very, very quickly. So they're very good for like building up status effects and things like that. Or if you have very high crit chance, very good for getting lots of crits off with. Moving on to Grimoire Mastery. When you unlock this at level 5, it's going to let you use Grimoire spells up to level 5. And it's also going to decrease the essence cost of all Grimoire spells by 10%, making them cheaper to use, which is nice. But essentially, you're going to have to keep upgrading this if you want to use stronger and stronger Grimoires as you progress the game. And it will also continue to decrease the cost of Grimoire spells as you rank it up higher. So if you plan on using, like, Exceptional and Superb, etc., Grimoires as you find them for their passive effects or their spells or both, you're going to need to continue to keep upgrading this in order to do that. So the next spell is Blizzard. This has a 3-second duration, 15-second cooldown. It conjures ice down in an AoE that deals, ice damage and frost accumulation on them. If you upgrade it, it reduces the cast time of the spell and also increases the duration by 6 seconds, which is absolutely nice. Again, you can use this to freeze water, and it's a great AoE spell if you're looking for some AoE damage to freeze enemies. After that, you have Fireball. Absolutely love this spell. It's such a staple spell, not only in Pillars of Eternity, but in Avowed. Costs 50 essence, 15-second cooldown. It's going to throw out a big fireball that does AoE damage. It's going to, build up fire accumulation, so can set enemies on fire that deals damage over time. If you rank it up, it has a larger area of effect, and it has reduced cooldown at rank 3 by 25%, allowing you to use it like every, I don't know what that'd be, like 11 seconds or something like that. It's a really good spell, and again, the advantage of taking this is that you don't have to have a Grimoire to cast it, so if you want to use it on your warrior, if you want to use it on your fighter, or rogue, or ranged character, you can. Next is Crackling Bolt. This allows you to conjure a powerful bolt of electricity that bounces between enemies and the environment, so you can bounce off the environment. Does shock accumulation and stun buildup. As you upgrade it, it just bounces more and more times. Great way to get some shock damage on enemies if that's something that you want in your build without having a Grimoire. Bristling Frost makes it so that you gain a damage reduction of 10% and kind of like an aura that deals frost accumulation to enemy melee attackers. This is best used on a melee character because you don't want to be in melee range if you're like a wizard usually, or a ranged character that uses ranged weapons. And at rank 2, it makes it so incoming melee damage creates an area of effect that deals frost accumulation on nearby enemies to help freeze them. And at rank 3, it further reduces the cooldown of the ability and increases the damage reduction by another 5%. So this is, again, if you want something to make you more effective in melee combat, this is a good addition. Up next is Grimoire Snap. This makes it so that you snap your Grimoire shut, expelling a shockwave of explosive damage that knocks nearby enemies back and deals stun. This is great for like a caster or ranged character that's getting surrounded, so you can knock things back. And as you upgrade it, it's going to do more stun buildup and knocks back even tougher enemies. As you upgrade it again, it's just going to reduce the cost of it. I don't think that's super important for the build. Probably ranks 2 is probably enough for this. Keep in mind, if you take this, you could also use it like on a fighter. If you get completely surrounded, you can knock enemies back, and stun them a bunch too. So there is an opportunity for that as well. Moving on to Blood Magic, this makes it so when your essence is depleted, you can continue casting by reducing your health by 150% of the essence cost. And as you rank this up, it just goes, the amount of health cost goes down to 110%. I'm not sure this is super necessary, frankly. I mean, unless you're not planning on using any consumables in combat, you can replenish your essence quite often in combat. you know, there are enemies that drop essence when you fight too, so you're going to pick up essence from enemies that drop. So I guess you could have like one rank of this for in a pinch, but you probably won't use it most of the time. Up next is Harvest Essence. This makes it so when you pick up those purple orbs on the landscape, they give you twice as much essence, 3 times as much at rank 2, and 4 times as much at rank 3. This is great for spellcasters because you can just pick these up and replenish your essence after combat so you don't have to use consumables as much. It's also not bad to maybe pick up 1 or 2 ranks of this if you're someone who's using like a lot of spells in combat, like even if you're playing like a melee character and you've picked up some spells, or maybe you use some expensive abilities. That way you're just kind of passively regenerating your essence from picking these up between combat or during combat. Up next you have Blast of Frost. This works very similarly to Fan of Flames, except it does frost accumulation, can freeze enemies, and as you upgrade it you get the same effects. 2 hands, double the frost buildup, double the damage, increase the duration by 4 at rank 3. So if you like freezing enemies, or again, this would probably be better on a melee focused build where you're going to be close because the range isn't so far. And you like freezing enemies, this could be a good way to get some, you know, freezing in there to help. Up next is Ring of Fire. This is quite expensive at 75 essence, has 20-second duration, 20-second cooldown. It increases your damage reduction by 15% and deals fire accumulation to melee attackers, so it's kind of like the Frost version of this, but with fire. It also makes it so that incoming melee damage creates area of effect that deals fire accumulation when you rank 2, and reduces the cooldown, increases damage reduction at rank 3. So very, very similar to the Frost one, but in this case with fire. So if you like fire more than Frost, you might want to take this one on your melee build. Up next is Returning Storm. This casts a powerful thunderstorm and an area of effect that deals stun and shock accumulation to enemies. If you rank it up, it also roots them in place for 4 seconds when you first cast it, and if you rank it up again, it just sends down the lightning bolts more regularly. This is just like a great addition to any build, whether you're playing a wizard or ranged character or a melee. Throwing this up at the beginning of combat in an AoE over the enemies while you fight can help out a lot. Up next is Spirit Lance. This allows you to summon a magical spear for 30 seconds that releases explosive damage around you with each successful hit, damaging nearby enemies. This is good for AoE. It actually summons a lance into your hand or a spear into your hand. So if you have passives that benefit spears, it's going to benefit this weapon. And you're probably going to use this predominantly if you're playing some sort of melee build or a hybrid build. And as you upgrade it, the power attack of the weapon produces a larger area of explosion and deals greater damage. So if you like power attacks with it, that's a great addition. And at rank 3, the duration is increased to 45 seconds from 30 seconds. So you can use it longer before having to cast it again. This is a really deadly spell in Pillars of Eternity when using it. And I haven't messed around with it too much in this game, but theoretically you could get lots and lots of AoE by using this ability and using it as your melee weapon. Next is Missile Salvo. This has a duration of 6 seconds and a cooldown of 20 seconds. What it does is it conjures a sphere of arcane energy that sends out missiles at nearby enemies. As you upgrade it, if anyone survives after its time is up, it'll smash into an enemy with the highest health and deals high stun damage, which is really nice. And if you upgrade it again, it increases the rate of fire for the missile barrage, so it fires missiles faster, which is really nice. So this could be a good spell just for damage. And again, it's a good one that, because it has a duration that's okay at 6 seconds, you can throw it out and then keep doing other things. So it's a good lead-off spell, or like a lead-off spell if you're playing a hybrid build where you throw it up and then go shooting or going into melee combat. So next you have Secret of Rime, Scion of Flame, Heart of Storm, and Spirit of Decay. These all basically do the same thing for different status effects for frost accumulation, fire accumulation, shock accumulation, and poison accumulation. They make them more effective. They build up more quickly on enemies. So if you have like a certain spell types you're favoring, like maybe you like shock and you're taking equipment that boosts shock damage and you have shock spells, then taking Heart of Storm would be good for you. Or maybe you like fire spells and you're using Fan of Flame and Fireball and Ring of Fire, and you want that fire accumulation to be faster, Scion of Flame would be good to take. It's more of like a specialized passive if you're kind of leaning towards one element, but obviously you could take multiple if you have more than one element type that you like. And keep in mind that the accumulation from this is not just applied to your spells, it can be applied to your weapons if they do poison accumulation or fire accumulation as well. So even if you aren't casting spells, but you like, you know, those damage types or want them to accumulate faster, you could take these. The next spell is Freezing Pillar. This drives a large pillar of frigid ice into the ground, dealing damage and high frost accumulation. Has a long cooldown, it's quite expensive, good AoE size and good damage. So if you're looking for a good like frost AoE, this is a good one. As you rank this up, it makes it so the pillar no longer breaks on impact, but remains as a lingering frost effect. And if the pillar shatters after taking so much damage or 20 seconds have passed, it also sends out an explosive damage to nearby enemies. And rank 3 reduces the essence cost by 25%, which is quite nice because it's quite an expensive spell. Next is Black Bow. This allows you to summon a magic bow for 30 seconds with arrows that deal high poison accumulation, allowing you to poison targets. And again, this is another one where, like, if you plan to play like a ranged character and you want to use this, you're probably going to use it like that way. You're going to take passives that apply to bows and ranged weapons that are going to make it more effective when you use this. And as you level it up rank-wise, power attacks are going to make it so that they pierce through enemies. So you can hit multiple enemies with your power shots, and at rank 3 it increases the duration to 45 seconds, so you don't have to resummon it as often. So up next is Pull of Aora. This is going to basically levitate 2 enemies up into the air for 12 seconds, and as you upgrade it, it'll levitate more and more enemies. It's a great CC for taking enemies out of combat. If you drop an AoE on them, you can deal damage, or you can lift them into the air and then fire at them with ranged weapons, which is also very effective. But it's good for just reducing the amount of enemies that you have to fight at once, and is pretty good on any build. Next, we come to Meteor Shower. This one costs a lot. It's 125 essence, 10-second duration, 30-second cooldown. Going to rain down meteors that deal high damage and fire accumulation in an area of effect. If you want to throw this out at the beginning of combat and then start casting other spells, it's great. And again, it's another good spell for hybrid builds that want to throw out a spell and then keep fighting like regularly. Any spell that has a good duration of effect is good for hybrid builds. As you upgrade it, it's going to make it so meteors break on impact, leaving lingering flames on the ground, and rank 3 reduces its cost, which is great because it's quite expensive. And lastly, we come to Arcane Seal. This has a 30-second duration and 60-second cooldown. It's quite cheap, but what it does is it conjures a seal at your feet for 30 seconds, and while you're standing in it, your essence regenerates. As you upgrade it, it increases your maximum ability cast speed while you're in it, and also slows enemies in it once you upgrade it again. So it's kind of like a good spot, like something you'd throw out at the beginning of combat if you were like a wizard or maybe a ranged character that's casting spells, and you would try and stay inside of it in order to just regenerate your essence in order to keep casting easily. So that wraps up our video on character creation. I hope you guys found these tips useful. I tried to show you guys like what some of the spells do, some of the abilities do, why you might take them, why you might not, what are good attributes to take for each types of builds. If you have further questions or further tips, please leave them in the comments. This wasn't meant to be a beginner guide, it's just tips on character creation. I'll have a separate guide on new player tips.